Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with the Candidates here at the Amica Lobby Lounge at Leo Palace. Today, we'll be having a conversation with Senator Tom Atta and Senator Jim Espaldone. For that conversation, stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And right next to me, I have, of course, Senator Tom Atta. Senator, how are things going so far in the campaign trail?
Well, it's starting. The pace is starting to pick up, and of course, that just makes the time go faster, but not fast enough.
That's great. Well, let's get into some of the questions that I think maybe the voters want to hear, or at least hear your responses about. The first question is a topic that's been on the minds of a lot of people. But can you give us your opinion on, I guess you could call it at this point, the controversial senatorial pay raise issue?
I think I've been very consistent in my position. When a proposal was put on the floor to roll back the salary increases of all elected officials and appointed officials because the savings would be significant enough to reduce somewhat the operating expenses of the government, I've been consistent about supporting that sort of policy. But then when that has failed, others have introduced legislation to reduce the salaries of just the senators. And that I've actually not been in support of, because it seems like it's just pandering to those who somehow feel like, the legislature is the whipping boy and let's whip them one more time with the salary increase. So I've been consistent in not supporting that position. But if it's a rollback of all elected officials and appointed officials, I've always voted in support of that bill.
Okay, so just for clarification, if there were a petition to repeal just the senator pay raises, you've been consistent in saying that you would not support that?
That's correct.
Okay. Should the people be given the right to repeal the current salary via means of a plebiscite? Yes or no, and why would?
Of course, they always have that right, and I believe that effort was attempted. They weren't able to collect the number of signatures. But yeah, if the community at large wanted to put that as a matter to be voted on during the election, I have no problem with that.
We're switching gears a little bit to something that's a little more timely, of course, the medical marijuana coming up on some final public hearings. Are you for or against the implementation of medical marijuana, and why?
I would support the implementation of medical marijuana, at least based on information that I have read up on. It may be an alternative to some of the other medications that may be available for certain illnesses. But in further reading, it also, I've learned that it's a very expensive operation to undertake, and it almost requires that you brought in the customer base for that marijuana product, and so then that kind of begs the issue of going into recreational marijuana, and that's where I have some difficulties. Now, if that in fact is the way we're going to go, we're going to need to put in some tight regulations to ensure that the product that is being produced is tested and it's safe, and that it is not ripe for abuse. So there's a lot. I think that's where the real challenge is putting in the regulations to ensure that it doesn't get abused.
Well, what if you had to wear that hat, right, the regulator hat? If you could author the guidelines, some of the regulations for the program, what would your top 3 recommendations be?
Well, of course, one of them is the requirement that there's going to have to be a laboratory available to test these products. It's not just one marijuana is the same as the next plant. So that's going to be very important. The third item, of course, is the security of these plants that are being grown, so that they're not vulnerable to, like we saw recently, somebody break into the house where they were growing marijuana, take it and then sell it in the black market. So the security of where it's being manufactured and the testing of what is being manufactured.
Now, also switching gears to the educational system. Right now, the educational system has a lot of priorities that it needs to sort of set. What are the top 3 priorities, if you were to be reelected, that you would do to try to help our education system right now?
Sure. So I really don't, I must admit, what goes on in the classroom, the conveying of knowledge to students, I really, I'm not an expert in that matter. But what I would focus on is, one, that we provide the necessary facilities that would be conducive to learning. So certainly the current RFP that was put out to develop a master plan as to how we're going to maintain our schools, that's going to be very important. But then once that master plan is done, is funding that master plan so we carry it out. It's also important that we are able to get our kids to school in a timely manner and reliably. And so I've always worked with DPW in making sure that we've got sufficient funds to keep buses maintained, to replace buses that are old and expensive to maintain. And then the third thing, of course, is making sure that we are able to support those school facilities with reliable water and power services.
Well, you mentioned funding in there, and switching a little bit to GMH, because I know that's another issue that's sort of prevalent on Guam right now. And every year we get the news that GMH is in debt millions of dollars. Where do you think people, should look to avoid this reoccurrence? In other words, do you think people should be in charge or should be held accountable for the debt that GMH is incurring, and how would you fix that problem?
Well, of course, because GMH is the only public facility that we have that would tend to, those medical needs. We can't turn anybody away, even if they have no means to pay. So that part is a given, and as a result, that is why the government needs to subsidize, to some extent, the operation of GMH. But it's also important that for those that are able to pay, either through insurance or self-pay, it's important that the hospital collects that. I know that in many of the briefings that I've sat in on, that can be a real challenge to the hospital, being able to get the billings out, getting the doctors to complete their reports so that the billings can be made, and then actually collecting it. So that's one piece of the puzzle that still is not where it should be. And then, of course, there's been discussions about building, an additional facility that will be revenue generating. And that one, I think I would need to look at it more, simply because now we have a competing hospital, we've got some new clinics that have been built. How do we bring all these facilities together and to achieve some kind of synergy so that we don't have to duplicate efforts?
Okay. What is your stand on the recent rash of, deportations by the governor? In other words, how do you feel about that situation?
Well, I think it gives everybody, this good, somewhat of a good feeling that, okay, we've gotten rid of those bad apples. That's one less individual that we have to worry about out in the community. But have we really solved the crime problems out in the community that caused these people to go in there in the first place? So we've kind of looked away and looked at deporting the offenders, but we really haven't addressed the issue in the community that causes these people to commit the crimes. The issue about deporting them, these individuals have to sign an agreement that they promise they won't come back. Well, we already saw a case about a couple of weeks ago. Some guy decided now he thinks he wants to come back to Guam. Now, can we stop him at the borders? I don't know. That remains to be tested, because we don't control the borders. It's the federal government. Will the feds actually turn them away? That remains to be seen.
Well, do you think that some of these people who have been deported should finish their sentences? Yes or why? Because that's what it is, commuting their sentences, essentially. Do you think they should be able to finish their sentences?
I think for the most part, a lot of the people that have actually been deported have completed most of their sentence. But I think it's important that they complete, for the most part, their sentence, because I think the victims do deserve also, a degree of satisfaction that, that individual did harm to the community, and they should be made to pay for it, and at least pay for some of it, and then the other part is, send them out, and we don't want to see you again. And I think that part of deporting these individuals out sends a strong message that, not only committing a crime in the community has a price that will require to be paid, to include basically being sent away and not being able to take advantage of the opportunities that are available here on Guam.
Do you agree with the AG when she says that the governor has no deportation powers per se?
Yes, I agree with that opinion, and I think maybe I can only speculate that that's why the governor has basically been turning them over to the feds. I think that the positive part of the governor exercising this deportation is that it has certainly gotten the attention of the feds that, hey, there's this provision in the compact that says that if they're unsuitable for this community, they really should be deported. And I think as a result of the governor's actions, it has gotten the attention of the federal government.
Do you think that the federal government will make a decision soon? Do you think that this is a process that you will see play out in terms of clarifying some of this, some of this ambiguous nature of who controls the borders and stuff like that?
Oh, I don't think there's any ambiguity as to who controls the borders. I think that's a foregone conclusion that really it's the feds that control it. But insofar as how quickly the feds are going to step up to deport these individuals and make sure that they do not come back into the community, that remains to be seen, and I hope it's sooner than later.
All right, well, thanks, Senator, so much for joining us. When we come back, we will be sitting down with Senator Jim Espaldon. Stick with us. All right, everybody, welcome back to Coffee with the Candidates right here in the Amica Lobby Lounge at Leo Palace. As promised, I have Senator Jim Espaldon with me talking about some of the issues. Senator, how's the campaign trail going so far?
It's good. I mean, campaigning is one aspect, but there's still a job that we still have to perform. So,
that's true.
You try to balance it out, and in the end, I think people kind of already have their feeling of which way they'd like to go on certain candidates.
All right, well, hopefully this will help them if they're not, because we're going to talk about the issues. And one of the main issues that's been brought up lately is the senatorial pay raises. Can you give us your opinion on the senatorial pay raise?
Okay, well, I need to make, I guess, a disclaimer at the very start. I was not a senator in the 32nd Guam legislature when that bill and that pay raise was voted on and enacted. So I came in one more time on the 33rd. My perspective on the pay raise at this point, I have voted to repeal the pay raises. At first I didn't, and that was based upon the presentation that was given by the administration when they were pushing the whole issue forward, that financially we were fine, we'd be able to cover it. And so when the first override attempt came, I voted against the I voted against the bill to repeal the pay raises. But as time went on, it became more evident that financially we weren't in the position that the administration had represented. And so I had to follow my conscience and say, okay, yes, perhaps we can't afford it at this time. I think that when it comes to the senatorial pay raises, there were several things that really perhaps insulted the people on Guam. One is, of course, how it was done, how soon it was done after the election. And there was that argument that there was never a public hearing, so procedurally it did not go through the proper channels and the proper procedures. Second, I think the most offensive thing that really hurt people was the fact that it was retroactive. You know, usually when you pass a law, it's prospective, going forward, this is what it's going to be, right? But when they passed that, they went retrospective and said, hey, let's pass a pay raise, but let's make it effective, you know, a year ago type thing. And that perhaps was the most offensive part of the pay raise issue. And I think the third thing, and the second, perhaps the second most offensive thing, was just the amount of the pay raise. Going from $60,000 to $85,000, it seemed like, yes, there was some personal, I guess, I don't want to say it, but personal greed, or, you know, to the thing, shoot, sure, I'll vote for $25,000, $24,000 increase for myself. And I don't object to the idea of a pay raise per se. I think it was just too much. I think that also in terms of giving yourself a retroactive pay raise was offensive. And going forward, would I vote again to repeal it? Yes. But that being said, let's be fair. If we're talking just about senators, that's one issue. If we're talking about directors and the governor, that's another issue, I believe. There are many directors who probably deserve that pay raise because of the volume of work that they're mandated to do. I like to use the example of the director of public health. And it's not the person, but the position itself. Throughout the years, we've passed so much legislation that puts a lot of burden on that director. Not only is he in charge of public health, but he's in charge of food stamps, he's in charge of this, in charge of that. He was put in charge of the whole medical marijuana issue. And yet he was being paid a lot less than many employees in the government. And yet he was tasked to do some monumental things. So I think we need to revisit all of that and take a good look. But in terms of the senatorial pay raises, I'm not averse to a pay raise. I just don't think it should have been as high as it was, and perhaps it shouldn't have been retroactive.
Well, you mentioned the director of public health, and you're right, they were in charge of medical marijuana. Medical marijuana is something that is very timely today because of the or what is presumably the final public hearings. But what is your opinion on medical marijuana?
You know, there are, first of all, it was put to a referendum, and so the people did vote. And so my opinion at this point is to try to move that process along, to try to figure out how do we get there, right, to implement a medical marijuana-based policy. To my surprise, when the issue was first brought up several terms ago by Senator Respicio, there was a lot of opposition to it. One of the things, but that being said, I had a lot of conversations with some very respected leaders of this island, or, you know, businessmen, you know, community members, who you would never think would be for legalizing marijuana for medical use. But because they have gone through their own challenges with cancer and other debilitating illnesses, they came up to me and said, you know, you need to pass this, because even though it was illegal, they tried it, it helped them through their physical infirmities. So there's something to be said about that. On top of it, I've read some recent articles that even in the U.S., there's some studies that have shown that there are definite benefits to marijuana use, medicinal marijuana, we'll put it that way. So we need to perhaps take a good look at it. My issue, though, is that how do you make it not so easily accessible to school children? When the bill was first introduced, like I said, several years ago by Senator Respicio, the largest component of people who showed up at the public hearings were teachers. And what their message was is we need to figure out how to limit or access, or how do you prevent access by the young kids, because their concern was they don't want stone students to come into the classroom and sit there and not learn anything. And that's a real concern. That's a real concern, because under the proposed guise at that time, and I think it's even probably in this one, the amount of marijuana that was supposed to be allowed, and even this, results in about 2 ounces, 3 ounces, you know, per patient. If you take a look at it, there was a study done, and out of an ounce of marijuana, right, you could actually roll 160 joints. And it's like, that's a lot of pot. That's a lot of, you know. And so I can see, you know, there is the perspective that if somebody who needed it smoked something or smoked marijuana, they could easily put it out perhaps after making, you know, taking 2 or 3 puffs of the marijuana and then putting it out. And because it was so plentiful, they'd be able to just roll a new one next time they needed it. But then what happens to the leftover amount? I can see it say, well, let's throw it away. You could find kids digging in a trash can, just using it for themselves as recreational marijuana.
Would there be the same worry, though, that you could have with prescription pills such as Vicodin if people don't use it and they throw?
The answer is yes. The difference is, at least as it is right now, it's a lot more controlled when you're talking about prescription drugs, because first of all, you need to get the prescription from the doctor, then you take it to the pharmacy. They need to verify that, first of all, that was the doctor and that the amount was appropriate.
Sure.
Medical marijuana is a different issue because when you start talking about quantities of 2 ounces, say, for example, for a 2-week period, that's a lot of marijuana. And then the question becomes, well, okay, if after 1 week's use you still have an ounce left, right? Do you then go back and replenish, and so you have 2 ounces for the following 2 weeks? I mean, who's to determine what that amount is? And I think that's the real danger. It's not so much in the overall perspective of whether we should implement medicinal marijuana, but it's in the details, right, of how do we make sure that it gets to those intended and not to those unintended.
Sure. Well, you spoke about school children, so I just really want to quickly go to education, because right now education is always sort of, it always has some sort of issue our education system is trying to work through. With the current status of Guam's educational system, what is your list of priorities to address if you should be reelected? Because you named 3 of them.
Well, the answer is no. I can't name 3 of them, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it's not within really the purview of the legislature to go down that road. That's the reason why there's a board of education. They're the ones who are tasked to focus in on exactly what the education system needs and what curriculum perhaps needs to be put in place to try to up the scores that we've been experiencing, to see how they can create the kind of citizenry that we need to have on this island. And our role is first perhaps to try to figure out how to give them the budget that they really need, and second of all is to support them in policies that they request. And so it's not really for us to micromanage at this point. That's the job of the board. That's not to say that we don't have a responsibility, but this is where you take a look at the makeup of the legislature. Right now we have, at the present, we have 2 senators in the majority who have been in the educational process. One was a former principal, another is the former director or superintendent of the DOE. I would imagine that they're keeping a close eye on what policies the Board of Education really needs to have in place to be as effective as possible. But for us to interfere, I think that was one of the reasons why that the law was passed in previous years to create a Board of Education, so that there isn't just a hodgepodge of ideas from whoever comes into office and say, hey, let's do this, let's do that, and pretty soon you have a plan that is all over the place with no real focus on what really is the eventual outcome. We can only suppose. So the board, there is a purpose for the board, and it needs to be to focus in on all those issues and all the issues that need to be addressed.
Oh, so you just think that the legislature should essentially just do what they're supposed to do when it comes to education and let GEB, or is it the Guam Education Board, handle the issues in the public
Right,
school
the Board of Education. And that's their job.
Yeah.
That's their job. It's like saying, well, what are you going to do when if a patient has a problem? Well, we're not doctors, right? I mean, there are professionals who do that. You know, we can talk about boards also. In this situation, since I brought it up, GMH is the same thing. There's a perennial problem up there. And yes, we try to help them out in terms of helping them set their fees, in terms of doing this. But in the end, it's the board who has the real knowledge of what needs to happen up there. And so, again, before you come to the legislature or even senators, right, the real focus needs to be on the people who are responsible for making those kind of decisions.
All right, and thanks again, Senator, for joining us here on Coffee
Thank
with the
you.
Candidates. And you can catch us next week right here in the Amica Lobby Lounge at Leo Palace. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.